So good to be with you all again this evening. If you will go ahead and open up with me to Deuteronomy chapter 3. Deuteronomy chapter 3, and we will begin there in just a moment. I mentioned Sunday and last night, trees doesn't always stand out to me. And part of the reason that it gave me a little bit of pause was tonight's topic, the Cedars of Lebanon. And the bulk of my Bible study, when it came down to the Cedars of Lebanon, had to do with just the temple. And so I began, when I started looking at all this, was how am I going to make a 60-minute class just about talking about the architectural design of the temple? That I don't know how interesting that's going to be, but I could probably stretch it and really think about the design and the shape. But then as I started to get into the study of the Cedars of Lebanon, there's so much more that is used with that imagery. And so I began to see not only just the importance of understanding what it was and what it looked like, but how God used that imagery to explain to His people the importance of faith in Him over faith in themselves. And so this evening what we're going to be doing is we're going to be studying the Cedars of Lebanon. And I've got that drawing there that came from my little Logos Bible study app of what someone drew a Cedar of Lebanon to look like. And you can look there and you see the people right there at the very bottom. I made sure, because I got a couple of maps, so I made sure to bring a laser pointer tonight. Right there, you see the people. They're really tiny in comparison to the giant tree. And so that kind of gives you a scale reference of how big these cedars were, which is very important when we start to get into some of the Psalms and some of Isaiah's prophecies about God's destruction of the Cedars of Lebanon and how important it is in that aspect. I mentioned yesterday, though, before at the beginning of every class, I wanted to start off with the idea of being rooted in faith and what that meant in our study as we go through different topics. And we talked about it, we mentioned last night, Proverbs 12, verses 3 and 12, that the root of the righteous will never be moved. The root of the righteous bears fruit. And that idea that righteousness is something that digs into God's word and God's wisdom and feeds off of it so that it is fruitful in His kingdom and reflects back onto Him. Psalm 80 and verse 9, it took deep root and filled the land. That's a passage talking about God's people filling His promised land. And it helps us to think forward to heaven and how we have a home where our roots grow and sustain us. Psalm 1:3, He is a tree planted by the streams of water that yields its fruit in its seasons, and its leaf does not wither. In all that He does, He prospers. That again, that idea that the root grows us through God's sustenance and providence, and that's what our faith does. We trust in Him, and He sustains us. Taking root is the renewal of God's blessings. That's specifically talking about Psalm 80 and verse 9, but also being rooted in Christ is being committed and established in faithfulness and constantly going back to that well in our life, whether things are going good or things are a struggle, because it's faith that continually sees us through life's trials. With all that being said, I figured it was a good idea to start off with describing Lebanon. In order to understand what the Cedars of Lebanon are, we should probably familiarize ourselves with the place known as Lebanon. And in that, if you look at me in Deuteronomy chapter 3, we get an introduction to what Lebanon is. Deuteronomy chapter 23, we're going to begin in verse 23. And I pleaded with the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, you have only begun to show your servant your greatness and your mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as yours? Please let me go over and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that good hill country, and Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me because of you and would not listen to me. And the Lord said to me, Enough for me, do not speak of this matter again. Of course, this is when Moses is being punished for how he acted at the rock. When God told him to speak to the rock to have water flow from it, just the act of trusting in God to get water to flow, Moses instead grew frustrated and struck the rock, and God punished him for that by not allowing him to go into the promised land. Now we do know before Moses dies, he is allowed to oversee the promised land and get a glimpse of what it looks like. But I thought it was fascinating here that Moses says, let me see Lebanon. Let me see part of the land that will belong to my people. And so here, the Bible refers to Lebanon in this moment as Moses is speaking of the area that Israel will become, or will inhabit. You also see it in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 4. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon. When God is describing the boundaries of the Canaan land, of their promised rest, it goes to Lebanon, which is in the north. And so you've got the southern and the northern boundary right there. And then what you see really is that Lebanon is often a symbol of natural grandeur. When he's talking about the cedars, especially the cedars, it's something they would have produced. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But Lebanon, when it's referred to in the Bible, is referred to in its grandeur and its pomp and its splendor. And so that's something to keep in mind as we go through this. Now, thought my map was next. My map's coming up. I've got a map where we're going to see where Lebanon is. Sorry, you can ask Bailey in my classes. Whenever I get maps, I get really excited because it's fun to dig into maps, and so I tend to look ahead and think it's coming up when it's not yet here. But Lebanon is used metaphorically to represent strength, pride, blessing, and fertility. It's meant to be this kind of analogy that Israel would have understood. These are our neighbors to the north. And so God is using this in his prophecies and his messages to say, hey, here's what you need to know about. And they would have referred to this in a way to kind of describe or contrast with what God was promising them. And what it had within it were cities like Tyre and Sidon. And they played important roles in the biblical narrative because they were important cities at the time. Tyre and Sidon, and we're going to get into the historical aspect of it in just a second for just a little brief moment. Tyre and Sidon were important trade cities. They were trade cities of a people known as the Phoenicians who inhabited Lebanon, who were seafarers. And it was their cities that imported and took the cedars, as we've got right here. They shipped it down to Joppa on the water. That was a product of the Phoenicians. But what Lebanon does is Lebanon's prominence in the Bible reflects its ancient economic and cultural significance in the region. When we read of Lebanon, we should understand that it was an important country. It was an important kingdom. It wasn't as grand or great as Egypt, but it was grand in its own sense, and it's one that Israel would have easily reflected upon. Historically, Lebanon was known for its seafaring people, the Phoenicians. These people would have, they made their own ships known as the biremes, and I don't know if I've got a point up there, so you'll have to forgive me if I don't. But they made these ships known as the biremes, which were double-decked wooden ships where you would have had people, most likely slaves, rowing the ships to make the ships go faster. And they would have gone up and down the coast of the Mediterranean transporting their goods. They were people known for their powerful city-states, like Tyre, Sidon, and a city known as Byblos, which was one of the capitals after a time of Phoenicia in the area of Lebanon. It was focused on maritime trade and navigation. Again, if you're making your own ships and keeping these ships in such an advanced status of the time, you should be pretty good at navigating the waters around you. And they were. They were known for their valuable goods, for their cedar, their purple dye, their textiles, and glassware. I mean, they were a rich country, and so they exported a lot of these goods to the countries that surrounded them. They were also known for their colonization and trade outposts. They were known because they had their ships and they could travel up and down the Mediterranean rather easily. They would establish little outposts all along that coast. They were known for their alphabet and writing. The first phonetic alphabet comes from the Phoenicians. And so think of it, for ourselves, when we sound out our words, we're teaching Benji to read right now, and so I'm learning how to sound out words in a different way than I may have forgotten or known before, but we can give credit to the Phoenicians for having this phonetic alphabet, things that we know how to write and read in a certain way that we do today. Now, Phoenician religion is also important because it introduced Baal, Astarte, and Melkart in ways that would influence Israel to their own downfall. Phoenicia had their own religion, had their own worship, and it had these idols made out of their cedars, which we're going to see in just a moment. That was a problem in how it worked. I do have down there shipbuilding techniques. That goes to the bireme. That was this double-decked ship. So, here's my first map. As you can see there, Tyre's all the way up in the north. And so you've got the Galilee region, the Israelite region, and right up here, that's where the Cedars of Lebanon would have started off to come down to Joppa, as we've got right there next to us, to then make their way to Jerusalem so they could build the temple. And so it was this port from the north to the south. And really, here's another map right there if you look at it. Lebanon is this green area, and you can see the top of Israel right there. It's the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea on the Middle East. And so this is, again, just a good way of reminding ourselves where this is. It's not some random place. It's not some place that we can just, say, oh, we don't know where it is. We know exactly where it is. And it's good to be reminded to see how their influence could actually impact Israel. It's not some far-off city. It's their neighbor, which is why it makes sense that their worship, their Baals and their Astartes or Asherahs came down into Israel in worship, especially when you see how Solomon grew, in his failure of his relationship with God towards the end of his days. Now, with that understanding, I want us to understand what Cedars of Lebanon are, which are, I say that, it's a pretty simple idea. These are massive trees. Think along the lines of the redwoods in California. I was thinking when I was coming up with this, the image that kept popping in my head was Star Wars. indoor, the big green and red forest. And for some reason, I just couldn't get out of my head, but I didn't put a picture of that up there because I was like, I don't want to put Star Wars into a sermon because that might not work out well. But it's these massive trees that all you can do is look up to and wonder where the top is. And that's what the Cedars of Lebanon were. They were huge. They were used, and they were stately. They were long branched. I've got distinctive in smell in there. I'm not quite sure what that meant, but I read in a couple commentaries that it was odoriferous or odoriferous. I forget the way the word is, but it smelled in some way or another. And so I was like, well, maybe that's neat to know. Maybe someone here can tell us exactly how they smell, but I'm not sure. It could have been good or it could have been bad, but it made them remarkable. And they were durable because in what they were used for, it was used for boards, for pillars, for ceilings, for masts, for idols. Anything that you can think of, they would cut these trees down to build. And again, if you think of who these people are, these seafaring people, their ships had to be sturdy. In ancient times, when the Phoenicians were at their heyday, the way that ships were used, if it wasn't for trade, in battle they would ram each other. They wouldn't have the cannons. They would have a mast on the front of their ship that was reinforced in some way, and it would go to ram another ship so that their soldiers could climb over and attack the other officers or seamen on the other ship. And so they had to be durable, and it was durable because of the materials they used. Here's I don't want to say modern because, again, I got this out of my Bible study app. That doesn't really look like a modern picture, but it shows you, at least in a more modern sense, what the trees look like. You can see there it is a big tree. It kind of dwarfs that rock right there next to it. Here's an artist's rendition. You've got there, right there at the bottom of it, I know it might be faint. I tried to lighten it up and contrast it, but you've got a tent right here. You've got a shepherd on horseback, kind of some flocks right there, and the trees dwarf them. So these are massive, massive creations. Here is a little bit of a more modern idea to see what a forest of cedars would have looked like. So, to me, one of the things that stands out about this is how kind of out of place it looks in the background. You've got brown land with kind of dry, arid mountains, and then there right in the midst are these forests of great trees, which should also be a good point to us to say, or to see just how valuable they were. Here's something that stood out. Here's something that was useful for different reasons, and it was Lebanon's to control and use in ways that should have been more helpful, but instead they turned it, as we see there, to idols in different ways. Now, one of the neat things about all of this is that even though Lebanon used it for idolatry in some ways, you get to 1 Kings chapter 5, and Solomon takes a creation of God, and he applies it to God's temple. If you look at me in 1 Kings chapter 5, 1 Kings chapter 5, I will have the passage up here, but I will say it's small on the PowerPoint. I tried to blow it up as much as I could where it stayed on the screen, but it is a little bit small. But what you see here in 1 Kings chapter 5, starting in verse, we'll just go and start in the beginning instead of just verse 2. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in the place of his father. For Hiram always loved David. And Solomon sent word to Hiram, you know that David my father could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. And so I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. As the Lord said to David my father, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, shall build the house for my name. Now therefore command the cedars of Lebanon be cut for me, and my servants will join your servants, and I will pay you for your servants, such as one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. Well, there's a few things that That is a wonderful point. You know, we think in our modern mind how technology can cut the boards and mold them. I imagine, like you, they came on the ship in one piece to be posted up.
That was one thing it commented on is that the Sidonians were masters at splitting wood, but those were 45-foot long boards.
That is a wonderful point. And again, it just showcases the majesty of what was being built. I will say I do have pictures, again. I've learned, I used to be one in class where I would shy away from pictures because I was like, I don't want to spend too much time on it. I don't want it to take away from the focus. And then as I've taught a little bit more, I'm like, no, pictures are fun. Let's use pictures. And so what we have here is the house of the forest of Lebanon. This is what was in Solomon's palace. And so if you can note there, all of these little circular round things are the beams. That's where the cedars would have been placed inside the room. And you've got these little rooms like that, or those might actually be, well, no, there's the doorway. The windows, I think, are these things right here. It wasn't very clear. As you can see, it's just kind of a drawing. But it showcases that this building was not just, we're going to put a post here in this corner, and this corner, and that corner. It was throughout the entirety of the room. And I think it's important that it's the house of the forest of Lebanon. And I think it's important that Solomon made it that way because he's trying to showcase this is God's creation. This is God's design, and he wanted a part of that to be in his palace. In my mind, as someone who thinks kind of in a historical sense, maybe he's using it to reflect. Maybe he's walking through there and reflecting upon what God had made. I mean, here's the wisest man in all of history, and he's saying this room is important. It's going to be known for these cedars. And I have to assume that's because he was reflecting upon it or thinking about what it was and why God made them. Then I've got a picture of the temple, at least a couple pictures. This is the temple itself. It's the first temple because they get destroyed by the Babylonians when the Babylonians come in and destroy the whole entire city of Jerusalem and conquer the southern kingdom and take them back. But what you can see here is just kind of the size of this temple. And so you've got here, there's a size chart. I know it's really small. I'm sorry. That's just the way maps work or pictures work. But it's got here a comparison to an American football field, which as we know is 100 yards with about 20 yards on either side for the end zone, so about 140 yards. And if you look on it, it would fit in about half to 3/4 of an American football field, this whole entire structure. And you see there just how big it would have been. You've got columns there, which would have been made out of cedar. The whole entire structure was made out of cedar, though the inside was covered in gold. And so you see exactly how big of a building project this was for Israel. It wasn't just one you might look at and say, you know what, we need a few logs here and there so we can make a log cabin. This was something truly majestic. And of course, it was to be majestic because God's presence was to be in that house. Here's kind of a cross-section of the temple itself. You can see, I don't know if it's as clear, again, I tried to lighten up the pictures, but you can see kind of in that siding there, kind of the wood inlay. I know it's an artist's rendition, but it is helpful to see that, to see, as much was covered in gold, there was still enough that wasn't to kind of show you this is what this is made of. It's wood, which is God's creation. And again, I think it's important to kind of understand all of this, because when you really take this in, it is just a constant reminder to Israel and to all that would have entered these rooms that this is God's creation. You are living in God's creation. Trust in God's providence. And again, you think of the temple. The temple was a place where God's presence dwelt with Israel. And we can look at all that, and we can see the tabernacle, and the tabernacle was good for Israel. It was a good place for God to be there with his high priest, to have his presence among the people. But when David brings up this idea to God, I think it's fascinating that God allows it to go on. That God says this is okay because he does have the tabernacle, and that was good, and it could have been and should have been. If you think about it, Israel could have been happy and just said, okay, we've got the tabernacle. But it reflects, I think, upon David's faith and desire to establish that glorifying relationship with God, to say, no, you've given us a permanent land. Let us give you a permanent house. And then you see the design of it. You read about it there in 1 Kings chapter 5 and the following chapters, and how every single piece of it was just this beautiful design. I don't know if you noticed there in chapter 6. In chapter 6 and verse 7, when the house was built, it was with stone prepared at the quarry, so neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. I know that's referencing stone, but it says no axe was heard cutting upon anything. There's a holiness that was attached to the building of this house. that we're not going to distract from what this is by the clanging of man's tools to disrupt what God is making.
I love the connection here. We were just talking about it in our Bible class a few Bible classes ago about Solomon building the temple. And the reason that God told David he wasn't, and what we've already read with what Solomon tells Hiram, is that he did it in a time of war, and God wants this in a time of peace. And so he uses a man whose name is Peace to build it in the city of peace. And now it's even being done not only in a time of peace, but in a peaceful way.
Yeah.
So God is making sure everyone understands that that's what this is supposed to be for. It's supposed to be for peace and finding the peace in that relationship with God and the peace that comes from God protecting his people. So I find that an interesting connection with not hearing the tools.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful just image to have in our minds. Just how, I forget how much construction we've had around this house and around other houses, but you hear it. It's constant. You can't really get away from it. And to think that here is a temple, something that is majestically built and it is not small, and to me, I would almost assume it's almost silent except for people talking. That's just special. And you even think about, the way the Egyptians built the pyramids or anything like that. There was probably loud commotion. I mean, I know the running joke is that aliens built the pyramid, but no, they had tools. They had little cranes that they would have used that were used by manpower, but it would have been loud still. And yet here's a temple that we see there in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 13 that is meant to house God's dwelling among his people. And again, you think back to what we talked about yesterday in the Tree of Life, where God was dwelling with his people so that they could receive life and blessing. And now the temple is a place where they can dwell with God in a shadow of the rest. That was in the land of the rest, where if we read there, in verse 12 of 1 Kings chapter 6. And what does he tell to Solomon? But if you walk in my statutes and obey my rules and keep all my commandments and walk in them, then I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father. There's a promise that says, if you obey me, this will be yours, just like it was for David. And of course, you do see David's faltering and failing at the end of his reign. But when David walked with God, his rule was good. He had success because God blessed it. And so he's given the same promise to Solomon that I think would have continued and does continue with each of David's lineage, but it's the same promise he gives to Jeroboam in the northern kingdom, where he says, if you obey me, I will keep your line going. And this design is that God wants to be with his people. And so here is a house where you can go be with God. And yes, there are permutations where the high priests were only allowed into certain areas and that sacrifices were done outside and whatnot, but it's still a place for the people to look upon and say, God is in there. He is among my presence, and so I can trust in that. And I think that's the beauty of this temple. I think sometimes the modern mind, especially once you see the beautiful church buildings over in Europe or elsewhere, you see kind of the ornate design. It can be kind of washed over us where we think, oh, you know what, that's taking away from God. That's more man's design than God's design. And so we can sometimes, to me, I've done this in my reading, you think, well, is that a little too ornate? Is that taking away from what God is really wanting in his worship? And yet you see here, and it's this beautiful relationship that says when you're in there, you're thinking about God, not just because his presence is there, but because you're surrounded by his creation, and you're surrounded by images that reflect back upon him and not upon you. And that's the point of this temple building that is built by these cedars of Lebanon. Now, I told you I could probably have stretched that a little bit and really gotten into architectural design. But I do want to spend some time now with the cedars of Lebanon all throughout the Bible, the biblical use of this imagery. Because it doesn't just rest with the temple where, Israel is going to be carried off into captivity and the temple is going to be destroyed. And so if that was just it, we would have no really use for the cedars of Lebanon after that. We'd have a nice little part where we could study and really dig in deep, but that's not it, because you go throughout the Bible and you see the images of cedar Lebanon that is designed to encourage our faith. And I've mentioned a couple of these passages already. We haven't read them because I was saving them for tonight, so we're going to read through them a little bit more in detail and study them. And the first one I want to start with is in Judges chapter 9. In Judges chapter 9. You see, in Judges chapter 9, we have the case of Abimelech. Abimelech the judge by his own power. And if you ever want to contrast, as much of a contrast as the book of Judges is to faith, if you want to contrast inside the book of Judges, you need not look farther than the story of Abimelech. Because all of the other judges in the book of Judges are appointed by God, where God delivers a message to the men, or in Deborah's case, the woman, and says, hey, you're going to rule and you're going to guide the people. With Abimelech, it is not so. Abimelech sees his lineage from Jerubbaal or Gideon and says, I want to be the ruler. I want to be the one like my father. And so he puts himself up in power, and he does it in a very wicked way. And, there's a phrase in the Old Testament that just always kind of tickles me because it really paints a wonderful picture. In Judges chapter 9, down in verse 4, Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows. If you ever want to know the character of someone, if it is attached to that kind of mindset of this company they're surrounding, it tells you with a big red flashing neon sign, this person is not a good person. Because what Abimelech does with those worthless and reckless fellows is he goes to his father's house at Ophrah and he kills his brothers. And it's not just some small death, it's 70 sons, save Jotham. Jotham survives. And he goes and he stands on top of the mountain in the area of Shechem and teaches the people of Shechem a parable. And if you'll read with me, we're going to start reading in verse 8. I'll go ahead and put it up here again. It's a little bit small, but if you will, just follow along with me. The trees went out to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, reign over us. But the olive tree said to them, shall I leave my abundance, by which gods and men are honored, and go hold sway over the trees? And the tree said to the fig tree, you come and reign over us. But the fig tree said to them, shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and hold sway over the trees? And the tree said to the vine, you come and reign over us. But the vine said to them, shall I leave my wine that cheers God and men and go hold sway over the trees? Then all the trees said to the bramble, you come and reign over us. And the bramble said to the trees, if in good faith you are anointing me king over you, then come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the bramble and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Now, I think when the parable ends with the cedars of Lebanon, I think that's meant to have us reflect that the trees he's talking about, asking others to rule over them, are the cedars. These great, grandiose trees, which, to me, I think he is a connection to Israel. What Israel is supposed to be, this tree that constantly grows and is nourished by God's life. And he's saying, here they are, these cedars of Lebanon, and they're going around. And you see the trees they ask to lead them. You see an olive tree. I don't know if you've seen an olive tree, but it's small. It is a small tree in stature. And so these tall trees are going to an olive tree and say, well, can you reign over us? And the tree says no. And so they go to the fig tree. In my mind, it's kind of this decreasing ladder in size and importance. And so they go to the fig tree, and the fig tree says no. And they go to the vine, which isn't even a tree, but it is the same Hebrew word for tree. And they say no. And so it goes to the bramble. A bramble, much like earlier in this passage, is a worthless bush. It's thorns. It doesn't bear fruit. It hurts. It is painful. It is not going to be good for anything except to be put upon a fire pit so that there's a little bit more light and a little bit more burning. And it says yes. And in that, Jotham's parable's point is that what they have done with Abimelech is not good, and it will result in their own destruction. Fire will come upon what they have designed and planned instead of what God has done in the book of Judges and throughout his history in appointing his own leaders. Jotham's parable here, invoking the cedars of Lebanon, is there to highlight strength and power in the cedars of Lebanon, but also the fact that strength and power will always cede itself to righteous judgment. The cedars of Lebanon cannot stand when God is the one standing against them. He is the one punishing the sin and the wickedness. No matter how strong they appear, no matter how powerful they appear, they will fall before God. And we'll see some other examples of this idea. But the faithfulness in this passage, I think, comes from the fact that we should be choosing the right one to submit to. I mean, Jotham's talking to the Shechemites where he's saying, you've chosen poorly. It's that, I'll reveal a little bit more of my darkness. It's the Indiana Jones line when he goes and he gets the wrong cup and he says, you've chosen poorly. And then it all just turns just terrible for the Germans in that aspect. The Shechemites have chosen poorly. And very shortly, fire will take care of the elders of Shechem, and Abimelech himself will die when he goes to besiege a tower. They will all fall. Our faithfulness must be there to choose the right one to submit to. And that means we choose to submit to God. And when we choose to submit to God, we serve in sincerity and truth, or there will be judgment for an unfaithful submission. As much as I might want to sit there and say, oh, I'm a Christian, I've been a Christian since I was 16, that doesn't do me anything good if I'm only a Christian by name. My faith needs to be sincere. My devotion needs to be sincere. I go back to Joshua, and you'll have to forgive me, we've been studying that in Nashua. Joshua ends his reign, essentially, by saying, choose who you're going to serve. Either go choose and serve those idols who your God just conquered in this land of Canaan, or serve the God who gave this to you. But don't just try to straddle the middle. That's our faith. Commit to God by seeing what he has done and move forward with that commitment and sincerity, or face the judgment of fire that will swallow up even the strongest of man's designs. Now, if you look at me in Numbers chapter 24. Numbers chapter 24. And one of my personal favorite Bible stories, and I know that's probably very similar to many of us who have studied this story, we get the story of a talking donkey. You know, it's a story that when you're a kid, you sit there and you think, wow, this is really cool. You know, an animal talking back to a man, and that man is not shocked. When you read that, he is not surprised. No, he is angry at that donkey, and he talks back as if there is nothing wrong with that picture. And I always think to myself, if my dog sat up and talked to me like a human talked to me, I'd be shocked and I'd be scared. And yet here Balak doesn't even blink an eye. In Numbers chapter 24, though, when Balaam is in the process of trying to curse Israel so that he can receive his greedy desires, and God is changing his curse to blessing, this is what we see. Numbers chapter 24 and verse 3 through 6. Again, I'll put it up here so you can follow along if you haven't turned there yet. Numbers chapter 24, starting in verse 3. And he took up his discourse and said, the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down with his eyes uncovered. How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel, like palm groves that stretch afar, like gardens beside a river, like aloes, like the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the water. Verse 7 continues, waters shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. You know what Balaam's blessing is here? That God's people will grow like trees by the water God has provided. They will be sustained, they will be nurtured. And what Balak is hoping for, this wicked king, is that Balaam will sit there and say, oh, Israel's going to die and be destroyed and be taken care of. And yet here Balaam is saying, no, they're going to grow. And they're going to grow strong and mighty because God is with them. God's people grow and stand firm in God's creation. God's people are blessed by God because they are his children. And in this time it is the historical Israel, the physical Israel that are being blessed. But we can easily take this and apply this to spiritual Israel from the New Testament. When we have faith in God, when we trust in God's design and God's power, the curses, and I'm going to put that in quotations, the curses like Balaam is trying to offer, God turns to blessings because his people are protected and sustained by him. That's what we see here. What we see in these cedar imagery in Numbers chapter 24, in just a minute in 1 Kings chapter 4, is that we see God's wisdom being imparted to man. And his wisdom is in the shape of blessing. You don't grow strong like a cedar in God's kingdom without knowing your king. And if you look there with me, we're going to flip now to 1 Kings chapter 4. 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 29 through 32. And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than the other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Herman, Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. What we see in this passage is that Solomon's wisdom leads to his proverbs in Psalms and Proverbs, in the Song of Solomon, whatever you want to identify as Solomon's wisdom. And those proverbs use the Cedars of Lebanon imagery. We're going to highlight a few again in just a moment in the book of Psalms. But he is using these proverbs to point back to what God has made. And Solomon's wisdom here surpasses all mankind because how does he get that wisdom? But in his young age, he trusts in God. He prays to God not for wealth, not for strength, not for a grand army. He prays to God for wisdom because he knows he doesn't have it. He knows that he can't be the wise ruler they expect from him, but if God was with him, then he could. And so his faith turns into this wisdom where we see later on in 1 Kings that foreigners come to him. And it's fascinating to me when you see the description of the foreigners that come, it's both kings and servants. All aspects of life are coming before Solomon to hear his wisdom that would guide them towards understanding God. And so you see the faith here. Solomon prayed for God's blessing, and God blessed his faithfulness with wisdom. And it's the same thing for us. When we pray to God for blessing, for guidance, for understanding, really it boils down that we're praying to know God better. We're praying to have wisdom in what God sees as right or wrong so that we can look ahead to that eternal city with the tree of life in the middle and have full confidence in how to receive that blessing. Again, it goes back to the idea that we have cedars here. Now, I will say, as a funny little note, and it's probably one just for me and Bailey, our brother-in-law's name is Ethan. And so forever I can tell him that Solomon was always wiser than Ethan. So, if you ever see Ethan sink, you can bring that up, but we'll see. Again, that's the one that's just kind of a little side note. You can see how my brain just jumps back and forth. But cedar trees are meant to highlight God's blessings and how God blesses his man. But you also see, if you'll turn with me to Isaiah chapter 2, you also see that God uses cedar imagery to warn mankind about judgment. In Isaiah chapter 2, verses 12 through 13, I'll put that up here, and we're going to be flipping to a couple different passages in Isaiah. So just remember Isaiah chapter 2, Isaiah chapter 14, and Isaiah chapter 37, because we're going to be flipping through them in just a second. Isaiah chapter 2, starting in verse 12 and verse 13, "For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low. Against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, against all the oaks of Bashan." And it goes on to talk about more things that God's power will be taking down. These things that represent pride. I think about Lebanon, right? This is their sustenance. This is their trade. This is their economy. And they're using it to bolster themselves. And so they look back upon those forests and say, wow, look at what is ours. Look at what we have that no one else in this whole entire area has. And their pride goes from that. And then you think about Israel. Israel grows prideful in what they can do. I mean, you think about some of the kings, and we're going to cover, or at least kind of mention one of them on Thursday when we get through Jesus' lineage, because one of them that's mentioned is awfully wicked, and it's because of their pride. It's because of the desire to please themselves. And when that stands up against God, what does God say here in Isaiah? That he will lay it low, these grand trees, to showcase his splendor. It's down there, if you drop down into verse 19, the people will hide from before the terror of the Lord and from the splendor of his majesty when he rises to terrify the earth. He will consume the prideful. He will judge the wicked. Now, if you'll turn with me to Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah chapter 14, Isaiah chapter 37, we're going to come back to that. I meant to put it in actual order. Isaiah chapter 14 and verse 4. "You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers, that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypresses rejoice at you, the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us." Here, Isaiah's prophecy gives a voice to those trees that have been abused and used by man for their own designs. And it says, wow, thank goodness that you have been brought low, because now we can grow. Now we can be sustained. And again, think about that imagery for a disciple of God. When the adversary is felled, we can grow. No woodcutter is going to come against our roots and try and cut them down. And we jump to Revelation. We were in there just a little bit, but the idea of Revelation is that Jesus has already won the battle. The adversary has been cast down, and so we have nothing to fear from his woodcutting of our roots. And when we do that, we cry aloud and say, thank you, Lord, for your power against that enemy. Back in Isaiah chapter 37, "By your servants you have mocked the Lord, and you have said with many chariots, I have gone up the heights of the mountains to the far recesses of Lebanon to cut down its tallest cedars, its choicest cypresses to come to its remotest height, its most fruitful forest. I dug wells and drank waters to dry up with the sole of my foot all the streams of Egypt." Here we've got, if I've got it correctly, I'm sorry, I'm confusing it with a later passage. But here we've got this phrase by the one who's mocking the Lord. I was going to try, I thought this was the Hezekiah Sennacherib, but we're going to get that in just a minute. That's in 2 Kings. But here you've got one who's mocking the Lord, and look what the words are being used, right? "With many chariots I have done this. I have gone and taken this. It's all about self. It's all about pride. It's all about what I have gone and done and how I have conquered all this land from the streams of Egypt to Lebanon. And when you see that image, again, think back to the map we had of Lebanon. All the way on the north part of the Mediterranean Sea down to Egypt where Israel had come from, this huge area of land. And here he is mocking God, saying, look what I've done. And the rest of that passage describes God's destruction of that mockery, of what God has done. You see the faith in this when you see how we are to grow in God's care and provision, because he has already conquered the adversary, and nothing man can do can topple God's kingdom. And so we trust in God's kingdom because we've seen the success in the biblical story and the wisdom of what God has said. All right. I'm realizing now it's 7:51. I've got 5 more passages that we're going to go through. 3 of them are Psalms, so that should be a little bit simpler. The latter 2 are along the same lines of what we've just talked about, but it's some more historical evidences of that. But in Psalms chapter 24, or Psalm 24, I should say, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend to the hill of the Lord? And who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to what is false and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation who seek him and who seek the face of Jacob. What you see here is that Psalms that describe creation, which include the Cedars of Lebanon, which include those who grow and establish their roots near and in God, God blesses. And so as much as we see the warning prophecies of Isaiah to say he's warning about the judgment that's going to come, we should look at this and say, well, we can be the Cedars of Lebanon. We can grow strong and mighty, blessed, not because of anything we've done, but because of what God has done for us. And our faith in him will only strengthen our roots. Psalm 92 and verse 12 through 15, the righteous flourish like the palm tree and grow like a cedar in Lebanon. They are planted in the house of the Lord. They flourish in the courts of our God. They still bear fruit in an old age. They are ever full of sap and green to declare that the Lord is upright. He is my rock, and there is no unrighteousness in him. And this is one of my favorite psalms that uses the cedars imagery. And it's because of what it describes there in verse 13 and 14. One, it's describing back to the temple of God. It's saying they are in God's temple, growing in there, in God's presence. But verse 14, even as they grow old, they're still bearing fruit. You know, there's a reminder to us that our discipleship, one, it's kind of a soapbox, so I'll kind of stand on and jump off. One, our discipleship doesn't end just because we've been baptized, where we say, okay, I've been saved, I don't have to do anything. Our discipleship does not end also because we feel like we put our time in. And here we see that the trees that are faithful and righteous in God, that the roots grow and dig in, are continually bearing fruit even in an old age. And the description has got there, ever full of sap and green. I mean, it's not just like a trinkling here or one fruit here in this season or that season. It's abundant. Because that's what God's blessing does for us. Have faith in him. Allow that faith to push us to grow and to be fruitful. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, about Zacchaeus, tomorrow night, when we see what that fruitfulness looks like as a tree that changes and grows once God reaches out to it and pricks its heart. Psalm 104, we read this yesterday. Psalm 104, the trees of the Lord are watered abundantly, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. In them the birds build their nests. The stork has her home in the fir trees. The high mountains are for the wild goats. The rocks are a refuge for the rock badgers. God waters us so that we can grow and sustain others. And you see that with the tree that he planted. And you know, the psalmists are really good about always pointing back to God and saying, this is what he's done. This is how he's designed it. He has planted the trees of Lebanon that man looks up at and marvels. And what happens but that tree helps others. The birds plant their nests in the trees. The stork has a home in the fir tree. And what you see is that, again, this idea of fruitfulness. When we are trusting in God, when our faith is planted in him and our roots are growing deep in him, we are fruitful so that others can benefit from God's blessing just as we have. Now, I do want to go back to the idea of punishment because we see that here. And I've always found this idea, this relationship between Jehoash and Amaziah really fascinating because Jehoash was a good to bad king, and Amaziah was a kind of a mixed review king where overall all good but also had some bad in it. And you see this relationship between them. Amaziah has defeated the Edomites. His army has been successful. But he's the king of the northern kingdom, and so it's small. It's not a powerful kingdom. And here's what happens. He goes to Jehoash and essentially bares his arms and says, look at me. And this is what Jehoash says back. And Joash, king of Israel, sent word to Amaziah, king of Judah, a thistle on Lebanon sent to a cedar on Lebanon, saying, give your daughter to my son for a wife. And a wild beast of Lebanon passed by and trampled down the thistle. You have indeed struck down Edom, and your heart has lifted you up. Be content with your glory and stay at home. For why should you provoke trouble so that you fall, you and Judah with you? But Amaziah would not listen, so Jehoash, king of Israel, went up, and he and Amaziah, king of Judah, faced one another in battle at Beth Shemesh, which belongs to Judah. And Judah was defeated by Israel, and every man fled to his home. It can be very easy in our faith to overblow what we've done. To say, look at me. Look at the battles I've won. Amaziah sits here and says, we've defeated Edom. We've been a conquering kingdom now. And I love the words that Jehoash uses, and he says, you're a thorn. You're a thorn on this tree. You're nothing. So be careful. Be content with what you've done, Amaziah, and go home. And yet Amaziah's pride gets the better of him. He goes and fights against Israel, and Judah is soundly defeated. And so we see this imagery of the cedar here, and it tells us to be careful about our ego, to stay humble in what God has done, and recognize our weakness and His strength. Don't think yourself bigger than God because you've done good works in His name. Always be faithful to His authority and recognize whom you serve. And then you get to Hezekiah. Hezekiah in chapter 19 of 2 Kings. This is Isaiah. He's talking to Hezekiah about Sennacherib. Whom have you mocked and reviled? Again, that's specifically aimed at Sennacherib because Hezekiah is afraid as Sennacherib's army has surrounded him. Whom have you mocked and reviled? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes to the heights? Against the Holy One of Israel. By your messengers you have mocked the Lord and have said, with my many chariots I have gone up to the heights of mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon. I felled its tallest cedars, its choicest cypresses. I entered its farthest lodging place, its most fruitful forest there. Now you can see why I was getting confused with the Isaiah passage because it's the same thing. It's just now in a different context. It's that idea. Don't let your pride think that you are better than what God has done. And I think as disciples that can be very easy even though we don't want to admit it sometimes. That we sit there and, it can be very easy and say, well, I've been a disciple for X amount of years. I've taught this class and that class. I've had this impact on this person. I can see my work. Look at me and look what I've done. And then you look across the pew and you say, well, I haven't seen them do anything. So I'm better than them, right? I'm better. I'm going to receive my seat at the top table in heaven with Peter and Andrew and, have this wonderful place. And you read these passages, and it is a frightening reminder to us that our pride has no place in our faith, because if it does, we will disease our roots and fade away to the destruction that is promised for the cedars who stand up against God. Oh, yes, Andrew.
Being in the image of God already makes us, in a way, a cedar. Mm-hmm. But when we let our ego come in, as we saw with Jehoash and Amaziah, you reduce yourself to something so insignificant. Mm-hmm. You already had, this goes back to last night, you already had what God gave you. Don't diminish what God already gave you by holding yourself to something so ultimately insignificant.
Yeah, absolutely. We take a magnifying glass to something good, and we miss the whole picture because we're so focused in on something small. Absolutely. I do have discussion questions. Now, again, I've left you 10 minutes to talk, so that's my bad. There are about 6 up here or so, and so we'll see what we can do through them. But you see here, the first question, you see that the cedars of Lebanon are frequently used as symbols of strength and majesty in the Bible. We covered some of the passage there in Psalm 92. It's also up there in Ezekiel chapter 31, I apologize. But why does God use a tree like the cedar of Lebanon? We've got the pictures, right? Well, it's hidden behind the questions. We've seen the picture of the trees. Why is God using that image for His people? And why can we relate to that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And you think of God and you think of majesty and splendor, and so He's using something that we can understand, right, in a small sense. Yes, sir.
And I was Googling, and
That's a wonderful point that, it's not just seeing, but it's all the senses that are attacked by knowing what that is. And I say attacked, it's just that overwhelming feeling, right, where you just know what it is. And that's a wonderful point. We've been able to go to Montana a few times, and it's always stood out to me. I've never been to Montana before, like 3 years ago, and the first time we got there, I just looked out and was like, this is beautiful. Like, it truly is. It's big sky country, and you're looking up, and you're like, wow, this is, God has made this. And it's the same thing, like you're saying, with the trees, where it's the resilience, where it's warding off the bugs, it's stately, it's used for all these things. And so when God is using this through his prophetic messengers, he's highlighting his majesty so that they understand it, right? Yes, sir.
As a kid, we had a lot of trees in our backyard, but there was one cedar tree. I'm not sure why it was there, but even as a kid, I knew it was different from the rest of the trees.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point. It stands out. Tomorrow we're going to talk about the sycamore tree with Zacchaeus, and I'll go ahead and spoil it. The sycamore tree is a tree that dies very easily, which kind of plays into the idea of faith, that if it's not properly protected as it should be, it will die. And so you think of it, comparing it to a cedar and a sycamore tree. A cedar withstands, and a sycamore tree will fade. And we'll cover that a little bit more. I know that's kind of a little bit spoiler, just kind of keep in the back of your mind as we come there. That second question, in Psalm 104:16, it says, the trees of the Lord are watered, the cedars of Lebanon that he planted. I've got the question there, what does this verse suggest about God's care for his creation? How might this extend to his care for us? Rewording that, when we see that, how can we look around us and feel God's care for us like a tree might planted by a gardener? Or what are some things that we can see in our life about that? Yes, sir.
When I think of a tree, I think of strength. But also, a tree has to bend and if it's rigid, it's going to break in the wind. So it can be a symbol for us to be strong, but also to bend a little bit or break.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a symbol for me of strength and resilience.
That's a good idea, that sometimes we are rigid because of our own ideas or interpretation of the Bible, when what God says is going to force us out of our comfort zone to conform to his truth and his wisdom.
Don't they like shed their bark too?
I think so. I'm not 100% sure, but I think so, because as they grow, to me, I've always kind of understood it like a snake. As it grows, it needs a little bit more room. But
So I have a different type of tree in my yard, and it's kind of splitting because it's growing.
Mhm.
And so think about that as you grow and fade, there should be changes to your structure
yeah.
as far as your character, just like a tree's structure changes.
Absolutely, that constant maturation that is going to change us from what we were when we first obeyed the gospel to hopefully what we are when we are called home. Andrew?
I think about, we often say God doesn't give us more than we can handle, and that's not right. Because I think that's what God does all the time, is he gives us constant reminders that we need him. But when you look back, it's much easier to see through your life where God was. It's often very difficult to see him in the moment. But once you've gotten past it, you see where God was acting in his providence. And so it's easy to look at a tree and see how God has been taking care of it, and the way that it's designed, and where that tree is placed in the forest next to a river. It's easy to see those things now that it's grown. It's easy to see God's providence, and it should be the same for us. If we're growing with him, we should look back and be able to see how he has provided for us.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful way of thinking about it, where it can be hard in the moment because of the trials or the stress, but by looking back, you can see the doors that have been opened, or the trials that God guided you through, and you relied on him, and you felt that strength. And, sometimes, I feel sometimes we can be a little uncomfortable saying, oh yeah, this is what God did, or this was that, but that's the point. That's the point of our faith, is to be able to look back and say, I prayed about this, and God answered my prayer. I think when Bailey and I were looking for our first work after leaving Little Rock, we tried out for a congregation in California. And it was one of those things where the people were wonderful, the work was exciting, it was something that was going to be good, and yet we were pregnant with our first child, who's now 5 and running around as crazy. And we were there, and we were thinking, well, this is just kind of daunting. This is a little bit too much for us. And we prayed about an opportunity that was a little bit closer to home, a little bit closer to family, a little bit closer where we would have that kind of support system that we were hopeful to find, and yet we didn't have that answer in that moment. And then 2 weeks later, we got a phone call where it worked out. And we look back on that and we sit there and we are so thankful for that working out. We can see other things where, we prayed about or thought of and turned to God. And you can see those moments where maybe in that moment we were stressed and anxious, but you get that comfort by looking back and say, no, God has complete care. And in the moments where I start to think my tree is getting bigger than him, he's there to just remind me of what he's done and what he'll continue to do. Yes, ma'am.
I think of the roots of a tree. You can have shallow roots or deep roots. And so as Christians, we want to have those deep roots by leaning into his word, studying.
Yeah.
That's how we get it. The trials and temptations come, it's going to blow you down, or are you going to stand?
Yeah, that's a wonderful point. The more we are spending in his word or in his worship, the deeper our roots will get. And that's how we grow strong and fruitful, is by constantly allowing our roots to grow deeper and never saying, okay, this is enough, but I always want more. Absolutely. Let's go drop down to that last question there. Psalm 92:12, the righteous shall flourish like the palm tree, he shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. We've kind of talked about it around and whatnot, but what can we learn about spiritual maturity from the image of the cedar tree? We see the strength, we can understand the roots, but how do we apply that to actually mature in our faith? Because we sit there, I think we've covered a little bit, but I figured, ask a little bit more pointedly. How can we actually mature? Is it just us sitting there saying, okay, I'm going to read my Bible for 5 minutes and that's going to be it, or do we need more than that? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm.
So if we put on spiritual eyes like that, and then just really appreciate what he has created for us,
Mm-hmm.
instead of worshiping the creation, worship the Creator,
Yeah.
and maybe we'll grow through trees with the knowledge of how they are.
Yeah, always keeping the God first focus. And like you said, Paul even, when he writes his epistles, he says, the Gentiles were a law unto themselves because they could look around and they could see something bigger than them. In that turn, you see in Israelite history, Rahab turning to God because she recognized who was at work. And it's that focus saying, okay, God's at work here. Now what can I see around me that brings me closer to him? Yes, Andrew.
I think when you think about spiritual maturity and a tree, it's easier for me to think about like a redwood. I have a better idea of that in my head. But you have all these different parts of the tree that all have to be growing for their own reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So the roots, as Pam brought up, they have to go deeper. It needs more nutrients pulling out of the ground. You need a growing canopy so that it can gather more energy from the sun to turn those nutrients into food, into sustenance. The trunk has to be growing so it can support all of that. And so by nature, everything just gets bigger in order to support all of that growth. And that's the way our spiritualness needs to be as well, is that constant growing and getting bigger.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't just focus on one and then miss the rest. It's all continuing. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your participation, and we will study Zacchaeus tomorrow evening.
Glory to